Hello and welcome to day 23 of the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar and my last Advent Calendar for this year. Now, which one have I got to open now? I'm on to the last one for me, 23rd. Here we are. War films, it says. War films. Excellent. We all love war films, apart, it seems, from Napoleon. So if they were to remake 3 classic movies and ask 3 of you from TooFatLardies to star in them, which characters would you see Nick, Rich and Sid play? And why are they perfect for the role? Yes! This is a great one for me to finish on for this year. And I have had a sneak peek through the keyhole of this door. And I'm going to choose 3 films to talk about. Plus a bonus film. And the bonus film, actually, is going to go first. So the bonus film. Now, the bonus film is a film called The Wild Geese. The Wild Geese was a story about a group of mercenaries who are engaged on a mission by an Englishman. In the film, Richard Burton plays Colonel Alan Faulkner, who leads a group of 50 crack mercenaries on a mission to snatch a deposed African president from the clutches of a bloodthirsty dictator in a daring raid. It's real Mad Mike Hoare African mercenary stuff. Among the cast are Richard Harris, Roger Moore, Hardy Kruger, and even Stuart Granger. Actually, a role that, if you did remake it, you could actually get Sid in the role that Stuart Granger played in that film. But curiously, I think the role played by Richard Harris, who takes on the role of Captain Rafer Janders, was apparently originally offered to American actor Burt Lancaster. Now, to be fair, that might have ended up as a classic movie cock-up, because Harris is brilliant in the role, and Lancaster, well, you know, if it wasn't bad enough, really, to have Richard Burton stumbling about in his God knows how many bottles a day he might have been on when they were filming The Wild Goose. But Burt Lancaster, I think, would have surpassed the levels of ridiculousness that were even set by John Wayne in The Green Berets. And as you know, I'm a huge John Wayne fan. But anyway, now, if I had a time machine, I would go back in time. I'd take my dear old friend, a 60-year-old Richard Clarke, and I would take him back into time, and I would ensure that Andrew V. McLaglen, who was the director of this film, who interestingly also directed Chisholm and some other great John Wayne films. Anyway, but that's beside the point. Who directed this film? I would get him to cast Richard in all of the mercenary roles in the film. So we wouldn't have Richard Burton, we'd have Richard Clarke. We wouldn't have Richard Harris, we'd have Richard Clarke. We wouldn't have Hardy Kruger, we'd have Richard Clarke. We wouldn't have Roger Moore, we'd have Richard Clarke. Richard would be in his element because he could play opposite himself in every role in the film, and all we would see is 50 heat-exhausted Clarks running around the African bush in red berets, firing their Uzi 9mm machine pistols from the hip. He would love it. He, as you know, has African roots, and he would be in his element. And for us, what a spectacle that would be. What a spectacle. That, Richard, if you're listening, is my bonus gift to you this Christmas. Okay, but back to the brief as written. So, 3 films that could cast all of us in. So the first film that I would choose is Zulu, the story of the defence of the mission station at Rorke's Drift in January 1879. If you haven't seen it, well, what have you been doing for all of your life? Here, of course, what Hollywood suggests as a handful of men from the South Wales borderers and Natal native contingent held firm against a mass attack of Zulu impi fresh from crushing Chelmsford's column at Isandlwana. It's white pith helmets and red scarlet jackets to the fore. So in this film, in our remake, I see Richard Clarke taking the role of John Rouse Melliot Chard, played obviously by Stanley Baker in the original film, the officer commanding Rorke's Drift. Chard famously says, "I came here to build a bridge." So maybe we could suggest an alternate script change that would say, "I came here to play a game of sharp practice." Now Sid, of course, would be perfect for the role of Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, personified most certainly unfairly, by Michael Caine. But Sid could play that role just as brilliantly as Michael Caine. I can just see him now, manfully wiping his brow after beating off another wave of sweaty warriors. And me, well, I see myself in the film, as in life, in the role of Ardendorf, a man who you never see fighting, but who crops up when the main protagonists have a question. He's a bit like a Hollywood version of the Microsoft Windows paperclip, for those who remember that. Now, there seems some uncertainty about the historical accuracy of Ardendorf's character, although it does appear there was a young lieutenant of the town native horse there who remained at the station, and possibly even that he was one of the men who brought news of the defeat from Chelmsford's column. So that would be Richard as Chard, Sid as Bromhead, and myself as Ardendorf, although I think it'd be great to play Colour Sergeant Bourne, wouldn't it? Who wouldn't want to play that role? But I don't think there are any other changes in the film that we would need, although perhaps to imbue the film with the true spirit of Lard, we would replace Men of Harlech with a group of Welsh lardies lined up in their pith hats, giving us a lively rendition of Up and Under, Here We Go, with the song of the Pontypool front row. That, my friends, would be guaranteed box office. Okay, so that's first film in the bag. Film number two. Film number two for me, Breaker Morant. Brilliant film. In the film Breaker Morant, which of course is set in the Boer War, 3 Australian lieutenants are court-martialed for executing prisoners. Now, like Zulu, Breaker Morant is based on a true story. According to military prosecutors, Morant retaliated for the death in combat of his commanding officer with a series of revenge killings against Boer prisoners of war and civilians in northern Transvaal. Morant's defence attorney, Major Thomas, who in our remake would of course be played by Sid in full King's Counsel regalia, demanded the acquittal of his clients under what is now called the Nuremberg defence, alleging that his clients could not be held legally or morally responsible because they only followed orders. Now, of course, just like Lard, the British establishment was set on making an example of the men, in the same way that the wargaming establishment would love to make an example of Lard. And British Commander-in-Chief Lord Kitchener is determined to see the men, Morant and his colleagues, found guilty, which he can then use as a bargaining chip in an impending peace conference with the Boers. So Morant, who is brilliantly played in this film by Edward Woodward, and Lieutenant Peter Hancock, who's played by Australian actor Brian Brown, who were, of course, scapegoats. The whole thing was a way of deflecting attention from war crimes committed by their superior officers. In our remake, the roles of Morant and Hancock will be played by Richard and myself. Both face their accusations with a feisty disregard for the establishment. At the end of the film, being found inevitably guilty by the courts-martial, Morant and Hancock walk away, hand in hand, to face their grisly end while seated on a pair of old wooden chairs. They refuse the offer of a blindfold and, at the setting of the sun, are shot by their own side. Now this, I am sure, is the fate that will befall TooFatLardies once the wargaming establishment catches up with us. Morant's last work of dialogue, as shouted to the firing squad by Edward Woodward, are "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of it," adding, perhaps in our version, "Playing the period, not the rules, since 2002. Again, I can see that as a Christmas classic. Maybe I've been on the mulled wine already. Who knows? But my third and final film choice is MASH. Based on the novels of Richard Hooker, it's a film by Robert Altman made in 1970, which follows the zany surgeons and other staff of the 477th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital in Korea. As a movie, MASH was brilliant, starring Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland in the key roles, and it spawned, of course, a hugely successful TV comedy, well, black comedy really, that many of you listening will, I'm sure, like me, have enjoyed through the late 70s and into the 80s. Brilliant show, brilliant. Now, if ever a film captured the ethos of Two Fat Lardies, it's this one. In our remake, Rich and I would take the two prime roles of Captain's Surgeons Trapper John McIntyre and Hawkeye Pierce, with their non-regulation attitude, Hawaiian shirts, jokes, having a gin distillery inside their tent. The two create a culture of frivolity that shows the war in all its ridiculous and absurd reality. Sid, being the multi-talented artist that he is, could take on all other roles in the movie, including, of course, the very stiff and by-the-book Major Frank Burns, played incidentally in the film by Robert Duvall, who, as we know, loves the smell of napalm in the morning. Sid would also make a huge impact as Chief Nurse Major Hot Lips Houlihan. He'd make a brilliant Corporal Klinger from the TV show and a fantastic Corporal Radar O'Reilly. And as if that itself was not enough to guarantee box office success, we could carry out a casting coup by placing Wargaming's very own Henry Hyde in the role of Colonel Henry Blake, whose job it is to try to command this slippery, irreverent bunch. I can just see the opening credits now, the sound of distant helicopters, the haunting strings and the guitar, and then, through early morning fog I see, visions of the things to be, the pains that are withheld from me, I realise and I can see. For lard is painless, it brings on many changes, and I can take or leave it if I please. And you can do the same thing if you please. Merry Christmas to everyone out there in the world of lard.